people talk about the problem of consciousness. And I say, well, first of all,
the problem being that they can't ascertain
what the dickens it is,
okay,
yeah.
yes.
And I say, well, what about the problem of matter? Consciousness is something we all at least have experience of, we're inside of it, and so forth. But what is matter? Matter is some form of consciousness that resists me. All I can say is that when I push that thing, apparently my will is thwarted. Matter is something that pushes back. And it may be that consciousness has phases, and I don't mean temporal phases, phases in time. I mean phases in the way chemists talk about substances in different phases. So, for example, water is in the solid phase when it's ice, in the liquid phase when it's running water, and then in the gaseous phase when it's water vapor. And maybe consciousness, it's still water. Maybe consciousness has phases. Maybe in some it's very rarefied. Maybe in some it flows. Maybe in some it's static. And in those ones you wouldn't find what we call consciousness. But the Buddhist idea that the whole universe is a conscious being that we respond to and it responds to us may have a deep meaning. I happen to like that idea very much. I think the idea that there is a something out there that just exists entirely separate from us doesn't add up to anything we know. Everything that we do know seems to be responsive to us and to require our participation in coming into being. I mean, in a way, we couldn't know it without that happening. And the way in which we encounter it changes what it is we find, so that one person encounters it in a certain spirit and finds only this, somebody else encounters it in another spirit and finds something else. So there's something that is responsive to us, and if we give to it and encourage it, it gives more to us. That's really what these practices that we're talking about are about, that the world changes in response to how we treat it. We treat it in a certain way, in a certain disposition, a certain spirit. We find the world to be a certain kind of place. And this is a very, very down-to-earth reality for a psychiatrist, or for any living human being. You know, some days I will think, why am I blue today? What's gone wrong? Absolutely nothing. It's the same world it was yesterday, and it's the same world that it will be tomorrow. And the next day I feel on top of the world. What has changed? Nothing. I mean, objectively, what has changed is something in me has changed. My disposition towards the world has changed. And we can choose to make the world a grim, awful place, or we can choose to make the world a place which is life-enhancing and for which we can only feel a sort of sense of gratitude to be sharing in it. So that depends on us. And so it seems to me we have a relationship with whatever it is apart from ourselves. That's the basis of things. And we certainly depend on it. But it may depend on us. And that's been a mystical perception that goes back a long way. Meister Eckhart, in the Middle Ages, a German mystic I'm sure you know of, said that God needs our love every bit as much as we need his, and that God depends on us in the way that we depend on him or it. Now, whatever your religious beliefs are, and I'm not paid up member of any particular denomination, I do think that I don't know everything, and I do think that there's something bigger and beyond just what I know. I think that's only a reasonable position, actually, in life. It would be extraordinary if our brains were conditioned to understand everything in the universe. That would be a rather irrational assumption. So I am certain there are things beyond what I understand, and they seem to me to be living. They seem to me to have the quality of life about them, to be responsive, in other words, not to be inert, not to be beyond our call, and not to be unchanging. And it may be very important that we respond to the world in a certain way. It may be as important to whatever it is apart from us, that we play our part by responding in a certain way, as it is to our lives, what we get out of it, that we see the world in a certain way. That is a personal philosophy. It's purely speculative. It's based only on experience and reading other other people's best thoughts on it. But what I am certain about is that it's not about something away and beyond. The divine, whatever it is not something remote and far away. There's a fantastic saying of Teilhard de Chardin. He says somewhere, people think of the divine as remote and alien, but it is by all, he says, by all possible means, the divine assails us and penetrates us. We live steeped in its burning layers. Isn't that extraordinary?
Wow.
And that actually, those words, as soon as I read them, they went very much into my mind as a sort of, yes, that answers to my experience. We live steeped in its burning layers. That seems to me right. And often that means it's going to be painful. And often it means it's going to be dark. It's never going to be just enlightenment. Because that would be untrue to anything that we know. That nothing is unmixed. Nothing is unmixed. You have to take the good with the bad. The web of our life is of mingled yarn, good and ill together. Sorry, that's not me, that's the bard, but you know. So,
is it as simple as just a choice you mentioned earlier?
Well, no, it isn't, because of course, how do you make the choice? Something.
If we know that, and we know that it is just the choice, then
yeah.
Is that possible?
Well, it is, and I think that the business of our life is dependent on us making choices, and as a result of what we choose, is what we find. We make, to a very, very great extent, our own reality, which is not the same as saying that it all exists in our mind. It doesn't. Obviously, there is something apart from our minds. Well, one can't prove that, but if that is the case, then of course this is all just a fantasy that I'm in a film and you don't exist, yeah, exactly. And anybody watching this film doesn't exist. But I doubt that one, and so I think it doesn't feel very intuitive. It doesn't feel very intuitive. The key thing here is that these things that are opposite, light and dark, and silence and sound, mutually arise. They give meaning to one another, they give existence to one another. That was a perception that we had in the era before the so-called pre-Socratics, before Plato. Okay. It's something that Western philosophy then lost, but Oriental philosophy has maintained, the coming together of opposites. It was something that in the Renaissance people started to discover, but then with the Enlightenment, which was a very rationalistic program, a very fine program for achieving many good things of which we are all the grateful heirs, yeah. But nonetheless a hubristic movement. My only problem with it is I love the Enlightenment and I love the architecture it gave us, the thought it gave us, and the technology, and the people were, some of the great minds of the Enlightenment were some of the great people who ever lived. But they also came from a place where they were pretty much still historically grounded in something else. But the heirs of the Enlightenment have just taken this rationalistic frame, and this will solve everything. We need boundaries, and we need distance, what I call in my book necessary distance, in order to connect. If you're too close to something, you can't connect with it, because you're fused with it. Which is what also you describe in some of your talks about being able to step back and be the observer, and that allows you to the empathy or the Machiavellian, and yeah, this is, it can lead to a cold clinical detachment in which one is no longer connected. You can use that as a force for can use it as a force for control. Yeah. But you can also, very importantly, it can be the beginnings of insight, empathy, and a connection. And in many ways, the business of creation, which is about individuals coming into being rather than an amorphous mass, is, the trouble with religions that say all is one and end of story, as far as I'm concerned, is, well, that's fine, but it's a bit like my problem. It's not very intuitive either. Well, it's not very intuitive either, but also it's a bit like saying, it's really the sort of flip side of when materialists just say, well, all there is matter.
Yes.
And
It
consciousness
feels like
is just a
I
mistake.
totally agree.
But it seems to me that if there's anything that we have to try and reconcile, it's that there is consciousness and there is matter, and it's not going to be easy reconciling them. And being easy with holding things that are hard to reconcile, but holding them both and not giving them up may be one strand in progress towards the wisdom. And it may also apply to the business of the one and the many. It may be just as true that there are many as that there are one, and it may be that we have to hold both those things together, because creation has gone to quite a lot of trouble to differentiate, it seems to me. And it's a point not original to me, but I think I first know it from Iris Murdoch, that when God created the world in the Genesis myth, he divided the light from the dark. He divided the sea from the dry land. And he divided up and created a multiple and wonderfully rich creation. So the process of creation is about differentiation within union, but not differentiation that atomizes. So there needs to be a union, but as far as possible differentiated within, while holding that together. So it's all about the tension between union and division. But ultimately they need to be held together. There needs to be a union at a higher level of union and division.
In my own life, I know that only by coming to terms with my shadow am I able to be at peace with it. And in a way that does dissolve the boundary.
Well, coming to terms with one's dark side is a good example of the need for the opposites. I mean, a lot of the problems that I think that individuals have that come to see me as a psychiatrist, but also perhaps some of the ills more generally of our society, are the inability to see that there is a dark side to everything. There is nothing that is just all good news. It doesn't matter how good your idea is, it doesn't matter how brilliant your goal or your value is, it has its downside, and accepting that is really, really important. And for a human being to be at ease with the fact that, yes, they have this, it doesn't mean to say you condone it, it doesn't mean to say that you nurture it, it means to say that you accept that it's part of the business of being a human being, and you may not like it, but a good place for starting tackling it is recognizing it exists. Denying its existence leads to all sorts of problems. So the recognition of opposition and tension within the whole is very important. But also, you said, the wave that is part of, now that is different, and that is a very good image, because the wave is sufficiently differentiated, if you like, from the mass of the water. A wave is an entity, but it is actually also entirely continuous with the sea as a whole, with the main. And there are various conditions that must be right, the wind and the tides and so on, that cause these waves. And so, but if that wave hadn't existed, then another wave might have existed. So, but that wave actually adds to the part of the action of the sea. It may be part of what actually results eventually in there being the erosion of a cliff. It plays its part. It differentially existed, but it has gone back into the main. Now, a human life may be like that. It never loses its touch with whatever else there is. But at a moment in time, it is more formed than it is later when it...
Sure. Actually, when I have concentrated on the dark, it has dissipated. But you said that perhaps that's not the case, and that there is dark and we just have to accept it.
Well, I think there is dark and one has to accept it. But I think whether it has power depends on whether you accept it or not. If you accept it, you rob it of a lot of its power. It seems to me the more you resist, not in the sense of the more you resist doing things you dislike and think are wrong. I'm not in favour of giving up on that struggle. But I mean, that's something different. You only engage in that struggle to the extent that you accept that darkness is there. But it is real. I mean, I'm not... look, when I say all these things, how do I know? I haven't a clue. I'm just a bloke sitting here talking to you.
You know a lot more than me.
Well, no. I mean, in the end, none of us knows anything
We know
about
ourselves.
newspeak, you know, and neither I nor you nor Richard Dawkins nor the Pope do you know what I mean? Know the answers to these questions. There just is it's a mistake to think that we could possibly have the data to come to a conclusion. It's all about hunches based on living.